The first time Dr. Allison Vega saw him, the fluorescent lights in the clinic hallway flickered overhead, casting uncertain shadows on the linoleum floor. She had just finished reviewing a patient chart when the front desk nurse tapped lightly on her door and whispered, "Room 3. You'll want to see this one yourself." Allison had seen a great deal in her young medical career. Bruised bodies, fractured minds, lives slowly corroded by poverty and neglect. Yet nothing quite prepared her for the figure sitting in the corner of room 3. He sat hunched forward, his silhouette swollen, distorted. His coat hung awkwardly around his shoulders like fabric draped over broken furniture. But it was his neck, or what should have been his neck, that brought her to a halt. A massive growth protruded from the base of his skull and extended down the back of his neck like a clenched fist growing out of him. The skin was taut, stretched thin, a bruised and veined canvas that shimmered faintly beneath the overhead light. It wasn't just grotesque, it was tragic. He didn't meet her eyes when she entered. He kept them down, hidden beneath the brim of an old baseball cap pulled low over his brow. A scarf, heavy woolen, despite the summer heat, was partially unwrapped, revealing the thing that seemed to grow out of him like a secret he could no longer contain. She took a deep breath. "Mr. Dawson," she said gently. He gave a slight nod. "I'm Dr. Vega. May I sit?" He nodded again, but his gaze remained fixed on a spot on the floor as if he had memorized each stain, each crack in the tile, just to avoid looking up. Allison sat across from him, taking in more than what her stethoscope or blood pressure cuff would ever tell her. The man was older, maybe late 50s, possibly 60s, but it was hard to tell. Years of hiding had weathered him into a figure of isolation. His clothes were clean, but well worn. His hands resting on his lap were scarred with old burns and calluses. No one spoke for several moments. The silence in the room grew thick, but not hostile. Just heavy. Allison began with questions. Gentle ones. Medical history, allergies. How long the mass had been there. Over 30 years, he finally answered, his voice a soft rasp. Started small, like a pebble under the skin. She blinked. 30 years. He nodded. Doctors said it was nothing at first. Then it became something. Something no one wanted to deal with. There was no bitterness in his voice, just resignation. Like someone who had been denied so often, he no longer expected anything. "May I examine it?" she asked softly. Another nod. As Allison walked behind him and gently placed her gloved hands on the mass, she tried not to flinch. It was warm to the touch, dense, pulsating faintly like something alive. But what startled her more than the physical was the emotional weight behind it. This wasn't just flesh, this was history, shame, loneliness, decades of being avoided on buses and stores, on sidewalks. She could feel it in the way he tensed under her touch, as if bracing not for pain, but for judgment. "Have you sought help in the past?" she asked, already sensing the answer. "A few times," he murmured. "Most said I'd die on the table, or that it wasn't worth the risk." Allison took a step back and met his eyes for the first time. They were a pale, watery green, dulled, but not empty. "Has it been painful?" she asked. He gave a slow shrug. "You get used to pain. It's the looks you don't get used to." The words stayed with her long after he left the clinic that day. That evening, Allison sat alone in her small apartment above the pharmacy, flipping through textbooks and case studies, searching for anything that resembled what she had seen. She had trained at top institutions, assisted in high-stakes surgeries, but nothing in her clinical experience had truly addressed what to do when a patient's diagnosis was secondary to their decades of emotional scarring. She couldn't get his image out of her mind, the way he avoided eye contact, the way the scarf had frayed at the edges from being worn for too many years, too many seasons. Who was he really? What had he endured in silence? She searched the town's medical records. Frank Dawson, born 1965. A few ER visits logged over the years, mostly minor injuries, never follow-ups. One note from 1997. Referral declined due to high risk. patient, withdrawn. That was nearly 30 years ago. The next morning she arrived at the clinic early, before the sun rose, before the world woke up. There was a silence in those early hours that reminded her of her childhood walks with her father, a small-town family doctor who believed medicine was a calling, not a career. He would say, "The most dangerous thing we can do to another person is make them feel invisible." And Frank Dawson, she realized, had been invisible for most of his life. The week went by slowly. Frank didn't return. She asked around town, but people either hadn't heard of him or said things like, "Oh, you mean that man with the thing on his neck," or, "I thought he moved years ago." He was a ghost even in his own hometown. But Allison was persistent. She found an old address on file, a small trailer on the outskirts of town near the tree line. On a whim, or maybe something stronger than whim, she drove out there one evening, the gravel road crunching under her tires, the woods whispering as twilight fell. The trailer was humble, almost skeletal. A porch light flickered dimly. She stepped out and approached, her white coat still on her stethoscope tucked into her pocket like a talisman. She knocked. There was silence. Then after a moment the door creaked open. He stood there, cap still on scarf, still wrapped. "You came all the way out here, I did," she said simply. He hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside was sparse but not unkempt. Books stacked in neat towers, a single bed, a desk cluttered with old journals, and a worn radio. One photograph on the wall, a woman in her 20s smiling with her hands around a child's shoulders. The glass frame was cracked but carefully taped. "My mother," he said quietly, noticing her gaze. Allison nodded. "She looks kind." She was. They sat in silence again this time, not as strangers, but as two people cautiously sharing the space between. After a few minutes, Allison reached into her coat and pulled out a folder. "I think there may be a way," she said. He didn't look at the papers. He looked at her, really looked for the first time. "No one's ever said that before," he said. "If you believe some stories deserve to be told, even when they've been hidden for years, stay with us. Subscribe for more stories that heal, inspire, and remember the unseen." There is a difference between being alone and being unseen. The first is a circumstance. The second is a sentence. For most of his life, Frank Dawson had lived beneath that sentence. Not behind bars, not within locked institutions, but beneath the quiet exile of social evasion, the kind that doesn't declare itself but exists in subtle deflections, the absence of eye contact, the widened space on a bench, the casual refusal of acknowledgement. He had become a fixture in the town's peripheral vision, something noticed briefly only to be looked away from. In his early years, before the mass grew into its monstrous form, Frank had been a boy like any other. He remembered riding bicycles barefoot on cracked sidewalks, scraping his knees on gravel, drawing comic book heroes with thick pencils on grocery receipts. But, even then, the bulge on his neck had begun to stir a small knot like a marble under his skin. His mother called it a little quirk. His father called it a curse. The neighborhood kids had a nickname for him by the time he was 10, Lump Lump. They whispered it behind cupped hands at school. Some shouted it as he passed by. Others just stared. And stare they did, relentlessly, curiously, cruelly. One day, in 6th grade, after enduring the usual teasing, Frank locked himself in the school bathroom, pulled off his turtleneck, and stared at the mirror. The swelling had grown slightly more prominent. He tried to press it flat with the heel of his hand. It didn't budge. In the quiet of that tiled room, the truth settled over him like dust. This wasn't going away. His parents didn't know what to do. His mother worried in silence. His father drank more. Doctors dismissed it as a benign growth, probably fibrous tissue, they said. Nothing surgical. Frank was told it might go away, but it didn't. It hardened. It spread. By the time he turned 20, the lump had become impossible to conceal. He wore scarves even in the peak of summer, hoodies with exaggerated collars. He avoided mirrors altogether. His mother had passed away by then, sudden aneurysm. She was the last person who touched his neck without recoiling. After her funeral, he tried just once to seek real help. He visited a teaching hospital in the city, waited in the cold lobby for 5 hours, surrounded by polished marble walls and indifferent glances. When his name was called, he was examined by a young intern who measured the growth, took photos, and said a surgeon would follow up. The surgeon never came. 2 weeks later, he received a letter. Due to the complexity and associated surgical risk, we regret to inform you that we will not be able to proceed with further evaluation. There was no number to call, no door to knock on, just the finality of rejection wrapped in medical language. He stopped trying after that. Frank's world became smaller, quieter. He took on night shifts at a lumber yard, then later as a custodian at the edge of town. No one asked questions. He never gave answers. He lived in a trailer home where the curtains always stayed closed. When he went out, it was during hours when the sky was neither dark nor light, a twilight existence. One night, perhaps 7 or 8 years ago, a local teenager snapped a picture of him leaving the convenience store. The boy thought it was funny. "Dude with a monster neck," the caption read. It was posted online, shared, mocked, downloaded, forgotten by most, but not by Frank. He stopped going out during daylight altogether after that. There were days, whole strings of them, where Frank didn't speak a single word aloud. His voice, when used, startled even himself. His trailer was filled with quiet rituals, boiling coffee, trimming the dry ends of plants he kept on the windowsill, listening to the crackling AM station that still played gospel songs and public service announcements. He wrote in notebooks, pages and pages, mostly reflections, sometimes letters to no one. There was one entry that read, "It's a strange thing to disappear without dying, to become the ghost of a man still breathing," and another, "I wonder if people would treat me differently if I wore a uniform or carried a dog." Is suffering only recognized when it's visible and framed in sympathy? Frank kept these journals stacked in a small wooden box beneath his bed. He never intended anyone to read them, but writing was the only space where he could still claim a voice. One winter, long before Dr. Vega arrived in town, Frank stood at the edge of the lake behind the old train yard. The water was frozen in places, the sky hung heavy and indifferent. The world felt suspended like breath held too long. He stood there for hours, feeling the weight of it all, the deformity, the years, the ache of invisibility. He didn't jump, he didn't wade in. Something or someone stopped him. It was the voice of a woman. Soft, unsure. "Are you okay?" He turned. She had no expression of disgust, no camera in her hand, no judgment in her tone, just presence. He nodded. She nodded back, then walked on. That brief moment, that almost insignificant exchange kept him grounded for another year. He never saw her again. But in his journals he wrote about her often. "I call her the woman at the lake. She didn't save me with words. She saved me with sight." Back in the present, Frank sat at the edge of his bed staring at the folder Dr. Vega had left behind. He hadn't opened it yet. Part of him was afraid to. Not because of the contents, but because it represented hope, and hope was dangerous when you'd gone without it for too long. Hope teased, hope abandoned. He glanced at the mirror across the room. Still covered with a sheet. He hadn't looked at his full reflection in over a decade, not directly. He stood, slowly walked to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. His hands trembled slightly. The muscles in his shoulders had atrophied over the years from compensating for the weight on his neck. The pain was manageable. It always had been. But pain, he had learned, was not the hardest part. The hardest part was being looked at like a thing. He remembered once a woman on the bus had turned to her daughter and whispered too loudly, "Don't stare, sweetie. That's what happens when people don't take care of themselves." Frank hadn't ridden the bus since. Late that night, after the town had gone quiet and the stars blinked overhead like old memories, Frank opened the folder. Inside were scans, research articles, and a handwritten note from Dr. Vega. "I don't know what this is yet, Frank, but I know it doesn't define you. Let me help." He read the line twice, then a third time. No one had used his name in a note in over 10 years. At that moment, he reached beneath his bed and pulled out one of the older journals. He flipped to a blank page and began to write. "Today, a doctor came to see me. She looked at me, not past me, not through me, but directly at me, and for a moment I remembered what it felt like to be seen. Some scars are visible, others are written in silence. If this story speaks to you, subscribe to Walk with Us Through the Quiet, the Broken, and the Healing. In medicine, there are protocols for everything: diseases, catalog symptoms, quantified outcomes, predicted. But there is no chart, no textbook for what it means to carry the weight of being unloved. No prescription for the invisible bruises of isolation. No surgical procedure to remove a scar that lives not on the skin but beneath it. Dr. Alison Vega knew this. She had learned it slowly, the way rivers learn to carve through stone, not in theory, but through presence. After meeting Frank, she returned to the clinic with a quiet fire in her chest. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, an ache, a moral insistence that someone had to stay when everyone else had left. She began by combing through the limited records available. County hospital logs, abandoned referrals, a single radiograph from the late 90s. The mass had been charted once, dimensions and density noted, but with no further investigation. The attending physician at the time had scribbled in the margin, high risk, non-urgent. Patient reluctant. She imagined Frank sitting in that sterile room, years younger, hope barely flickering behind tired eyes only to be reduced to a footnote. So she started again from the beginning. She called in a favor from her former mentor at the university hospital in the city, Dr. Omar Patel, a neurologist known for his work on cranial fibrous anomalies. "I'm sending you something unusual," she told him over the phone. "It's not just a case, it's a person who's been buried under it." Dr. Patel reviewed the imaging she managed to extract with the clinic's outdated CT machine. After several days, he called back. "It's complex, yes," he admitted, "but not impossible. It's likely a long-term plexiform neurofibroma, slow-growing, likely benign, but difficult due to its vascularity. Surgery would be high risk, but not hopeless, not hopeless." 2 words that lit something in her. She put together a treatment plan not just for the tumor, but for Frank's entire reality. Wound care, physical therapy, pre-assessment, a psychological support option if he ever consented. A small local charity had agreed to cover some of the pre-op testing. The rest she would figure out later. One afternoon, she returned to Frank's trailer armed not with syringes or white coats, but with something far more delicate presence. He was sitting by the window, the scarf still looped tightly around his neck, even indoors. "I brought lunch," she offered, holding out a paper bag. "And tea. The decent kind, not the powdered stuff." He nodded toward the counter. "Cups are in the second drawer." They sat at the kitchen table. 2 mismatched chairs. 1 cracked mug. Steam curled between them like unspoken memories. Allison didn't rush. She didn't press. Instead, she let silence do what it does best when unafraid make room. After a while, she said, "You write." Frank's eyes flicked toward her, then toward the small wooden box near the foot of the bed. "I noticed your journals. I didn't read them," she added quickly, "but I saw how carefully they were stacked." He looked away. "They're not for reading. They don't have to be," she said, "but they matter." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They're just a way to stay real. When the world stops reflecting you, you start writing to remember who you were." Later that week, with Frank's cautious consent, Allison returned with equipment to run some basic blood work and scans. He didn't flinch at the needles. Pain, she knew by now, was a language he no longer translated. As she placed the stethoscope over his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of a heart that had survived far more than its anatomy suggested, she found herself wondering, what would it mean for him to be free of this weight, not just the tumor, but the story it had forced him to live? A few days later, a storm swept through the town. The power flickered. The streets emptied. Allison returned to Frank's home with a flashlight and a blanket, unsure if he'd even answer the door. He did. His trailer was dark but warm. Candles flickered in corners. A battery-powered radio hummed low. "I brought backup heat," she said, lifting the blanket. Frank gestured toward the chair across from him. "You ever notice how quiet everything gets when it rains?" "I like it," she replied. "Makes the world slow down." He was holding a notebook, the same kind that had been tucked in the wooden box. He handed it to her. "Just one entry," he said, "if you want." She opened it slowly. The handwriting was neat, almost reverent. She began to read. "Sometimes I think the thing on my neck isn't a tumor. It's memory hardened into flesh. Every name I was called. Every doorway I walked through sideways. Every time I apologized just for existing. They gathered there coiled together like roots. And now I carry them like a second head always behind me, always whispering." She swallowed hard. Frank watched her, but not with fear, with quiet acceptance. "There's more," he said, "but that one feels truest." That night, Allison couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, haunted not by illness but by the humanity of it all. She realized Frank wasn't waiting for surgery. He was waiting to be believed. That he was more than what had happened to him. That his story didn't end in shame. The next morning, she submitted the case for a surgical consult with the university hospital. She included Frank's consent preliminary blood work and the CT scans. She also included something unconventional, a scanned copy of his journal excerpt. In her email to Dr. Patel, she wrote, "You'll see the scans attached. But more importantly, you'll see the man. He's not just tissue and nerve. He's a life half lived in hiding. If we can help him, we must." A week passed. Then a reply, "We'll take him. It won't be easy. But no one deserves to carry this alone." Allison printed the email and drove to Frank's home. He opened the door before she knocked. She held up the paper. They said yes. He didn't speak. He simply sat back down at the kitchen table and stared at the note in his hands. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't have to say anything," she replied. "You just have to let them see you." For a long time, neither spoke. The wind rattled the trailer's thin walls. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Then Frank said almost inaudibly, "I used to dream about cutting it off myself. When I was younger, I thought maybe if I could just be normal, just once people would stop acting like I was contagious." Allison leaned forward. "You're not the one who's been sick," she said softly. "The world is." He blinked as if trying to absorb the weight of that sentence. Before she left, he handed her a folded piece of paper. "Another journal page?" she asked. He shook his head. "A letter I never sent." "To whom?" "To myself. For after the surgery, in case I don't make it." She took it without opening it. "I'll keep it safe," she promised. This is more than a story about a tumor. It's about the things we carry and the courage to set them down. If you believe in second chances, subscribe to walk this journey with us. The day came wrapped in overcast skies and the scent of early spring. There was no dramatic sunrise, no cinematic light filtering through the blinds. Just grayness, stillness, as if the world in its own quiet way was holding its breath. Frank Dawson stood in front of the mirror for the first time in 15 years. The sheet that had long covered the glass now lay crumpled on the floor like a discarded secret. He studied his reflection cautiously, slowly. The scarf was still around his neck, but even he knew it was no longer a disguise. It was a ritual, one that would end today. The mass loomed behind him like a shadow that had taken form, bulging grotesque, alive in its stillness. But his eyes, those pale green eyes, were clearer than they had been in decades. There was something flickering there. Not pride, not fear, readiness. Dr. Allison Vega waited in the corridor of the university hospital, her hands clasped, her breath shallow. It wasn't just another case. This wasn't medicine as usual. This was the unraveling of 30 years of silence. The kind of surgery that had consequences far beyond tissue and vessels. A reckoning. When Frank arrived, escorted by one of the intake nurses, she noticed something different. He wasn't hiding anymore. His scarf was looped loosely around his neck, but it no longer clung like armor. His shoulders weren't hunched. He walked slowly, but each step had a strange elegance, like someone walking toward the gallows with dignity, not defeat. They didn't speak much. Words she realized were too small for mornings like this. Pre-op was a blur of forms vitals and informed consent. Frank signed everything with a steady hand, the pen trembling only slightly as he scribbled his name, a name that had rarely been spoken aloud in the last decade. In one of the forms, under the question, "Do you wish to have spiritual care present before surgery?" Frank checked the box marked, "No, but thank you." He had made peace in his own way. Allison stood beside him as the anesthesiologist prepared the IV. The surgical team was briefed, the scans reviewed again, and the route of incision marked carefully with a blue surgical pen tracing the curve of something that had long been hidden now brought fully into light. Frank turned to her eyes calm. "I brought something," he murmured. From his bag, he pulled out a folded sheet of notebook paper creased at the edges, soft from being handled many times. "My last journal entry," he said. "If I don't wake up, maybe someone should read it." Allison hesitated, then took the paper. She didn't open it. "I'll keep it safe," she whispered. In the operating room, the lights were brighter than the sun, sterile and unwavering. Machines beeped in steady rhythm. Blue gowns rustled. The air was thick with antiseptic and tension. The lead surgeon, Dr. Patel, reviewed the final checks. Nurses confirmed vitals. An anesthesiologist counted down from 10. Frank exhaled, and the world went dark. The surgery began at 9:42 a.m. The first incision was clean. Blood vessels protested, but the team moved with precision. Hours passed, 4, then 6. The tumor's root system was more complex than expected, its edges interwoven with muscle and fragile nerves. Every movement demanded deliberation. Every centimeter gained was a negotiation between science and risk. At hour 7, Frank's blood pressure dropped. Alarms blared. Allison, watching from the observation window, felt her chest tighten as nurses scrambled and the anesthesiologist recalibrated doses. There was a moment, brief but brutal, when even Dr. Patel hesitated. But Frank stabilized, and the work continued. At 4:03 p.m., the tumor was fully removed. It lay on a tray, inert and glistening under the lights, a grotesque monument to decades of wait. Dr. Patel closed the final sutures with trembling hands. Around him, the team exhaled collectively. Not one of them spoke. They didn't need to. They had witnessed something far larger than a procedure. Recovery was slow. Frank remained unconscious for hours. Machines monitored his heartbeat, his oxygen levels, the rhythms of a body relearning how to exist without the burden it had carried for so long. Allison stayed beside him, the folded journal page still in her pocket. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she watched the rise and fall of his chest, the subtle flickers beneath his eyelids. She thought about the first time she saw him, the way the world seemed to recoil from his presence. The way she had almost looked away. Almost. But she hadn't. When Frank finally opened his eyes, it was past midnight. The room was dim-lit only by the glow of a monitor and the low hum of the hallway light. He blinked slowly, registering the ceiling, the IV, the muted ache in his body. His hand rose instinctively toward his neck. There was bandaging, thick but gentle. But there was no weight, no pressure pulling him backward. Only absence. His fingers trembled. Tears did not fall, but they brimmed a silent offering to something unnameable. Allison was dozing in the chair beside his bed when she felt his gaze. She opened her eyes and smiled. "You made it," she said. He nodded. Just once. But it carried the gravity of an entire life. She reached into her coat and handed him the folded page. "I didn't read it." He looked at it for a long time, then tucked it away. "Maybe someday," he said. By morning, news had spread through the hospital about the man with the tumor, the surgeon who said it was impossible, the young doctor who wouldn't give up. One nurse whispered, "It was like watching someone be reborn." Another said, "He looked like he'd stepped out of a shadow." The days that followed were filled with routine wound cleaning, physical therapy, pain management. But beneath it all, something extraordinary was unfolding. Frank laughed. Softly, awkwardly, but with real breath. He requested to sit by the window. He asked about the weather. He ate toast and remarked that it tasted better than he remembered. One morning a child passed his door and stopped peeking inside. Frank turned and smiled gently. The boy stared for a moment, then waved. Frank waved back. It was the first wave he had received in years. Allison continued her rounds, her paperwork, her life. But she kept coming back to that room. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to witness it, the miracle beyond medicine. The quiet bloom of dignity. One afternoon she brought a mirror. Frank looked at it, hesitated, then nodded. She held it up slowly. He studied his reflection, not just the scar which curved like a river across his neck, but the face that had always hidden behind it. He didn't flinch. "Looks like a storm passed through," he said. She smiled, and left the landscape changed. He didn't wear the scarf after that. On the day he was discharged, the hospital staff gathered near the entrance. No fanfare, no applause, just presence. Nurses, orderlies, doctors, people who had witnessed something unspoken. Frank stepped into the sunlight. His skin was pale, but his eyes were clear. He wore a collared shirt, no scarf, no hoodie, just himself. He paused on the steps and looked at the sky for a long time. Then he walked forward unhurried into the world that had once refused to see him. In his journal, he later wrote, "I used to think the tumor was the weight I carried. But the real burden was believing I was unworthy of being seen. Today, I was visible. Not as a deformity, but as a man. Healing does not arrive all at once. It comes in ripples, in halting footsteps, in the uncertain way someone learns to walk again after forgetting what ground beneath their feet feels like." For Frank Dawson, the world after surgery was at once strange and familiar, like returning to a house you once lived in, only to find that every wall has shifted slightly. He left the hospital with more than a scar. He carried silence that had been broken, and in its place something new had begun to grow. At first he moved through the world like someone stepping onto a frozen lake, testing each moment for the threat of collapse. Every time he walked into a store or passed someone on the street, he expected the familiar recoil, the whispered words, the aversion of eyes. But they didn't come. People didn't look away. They looked at him. Some nodded, some smiled. One elderly woman at the farmer's market simply said, "Good morning," as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And for Frank, it was not. Allison had suggested that he take things slowly, no pressure, no expectations, just allow himself to live in increments. He followed her advice. Mornings began with tea, a walk to the mailbox. Sitting outside under the sycamore tree that had long shaded his trailer but never welcomed him until now. He began to write again, not just to himself, but for others. One afternoon he posted an anonymous message on an online support forum for people living with disfigurements and visible conditions. He didn't include pictures, just words. For 30 years, I believed I was something to be hidden. My face, my name, my pain. But today, I walked into the sun and no one looked away. If you're still hiding, I see you. The post went viral in its quiet way. Not with fanfare or algorithms, but with resonance. Dozens of replies, then hundreds. People who had never met Frank shared their own stories of birthmarks, burned scars, surgical injuries. One man said, "I've never dared to take off my compression mask in public, but maybe tomorrow I will." Frank read every reply, every name, every thank you. Weeks passed. The scar on his neck faded from angry red to gentle pink. His gait grew steadier. His voice, once a dusty echo, now held warmth. He began volunteering at a community center once a week, helping with reading programs guiding young boys in woodworking. No one asked about his past. They only listened when he chose to share it. There was one boy in particular, 12 years old, shy with a slanted posture and a deep scar across his temple. His name was Leo Rojas. Leo rarely spoke, but he drew vivid charcoal sketches on cheap paper. Often he drew faces. And in every face there was a mark, some blemish, some detail, like he was trying to say, "This is real. This matters." Frank recognized something in him. One day, Leo stayed after the session ended. He didn't speak, but he handed Frank a drawing. It was a man, tall, quiet, standing beneath a tree with a visible scar curling along his neck like a question mark. Frank looked at it, then at the boy. Neither said anything. They didn't need to. That evening, Frank pulled out one of his journals and wrote, "He didn't flinch when he saw me. He saw the scar and still handed me his art. Maybe it's not about removing the weight. Maybe it's about sharing it long enough for someone else to help you carry it." Allison continued to check on him not as a doctor but as something else, something closer. They would sit by the lake, sometimes the same lake where Frank had once stood on the edge of surrender. Now he returned not to disappear, but to be present. They spoke of things both mundane and vast. She told him about her father's belief in dignity-based medicine. He told her about the woman at the lake, the stranger whose simple acknowledgement had kept him from letting go. "She never knew," he said quietly, "that she saved me." Allison looked out across the water. "Sometimes," she said, "we save people by staying human." One morning, Frank received a letter in the mail from the university hospital. It contained a formal summary of the surgery photos of the removed mass and a letter from Dr. Patel. At the bottom it read, "Your recovery was remarkable, but your courage immeasurable. Thank you for teaching us that medicine can heal more than the body." He folded the letter gently, placed it in a wooden frame, and set it beside the only other photo he kept, the one of his mother holding him as a boy. As summer unfolded, Frank began to notice small things he had forgotten. The warmth of wind on the back of his neck, the tickle of a collar resting flat against his shirt, the way shadows no longer moved with him like burdens. He started walking through town without a hat, then without the scarf, then with his head held high. People still stared occasionally, but not with malice, with curiosity, with recognition. He had become something rare in a world addicted to perfection, visible and unafraid. One Sunday, the community center held an open house. Families gathered. Children played. Someone brought lemonade. Frank arrived early and helped set up chairs. Leo stood beside him, clutching a sketchbook. Toward the end of the event, one of the organizers asked if Frank would be willing to share a few words. He hesitated. Speaking wasn't his strength, but he nodded. He stepped up to the small platform. No microphone, just his voice. He cleared his throat. "I spent many years hiding," he said, "from mirrors, from people, from myself." The room quieted. But a doctor once told me I wasn't the one who'd been sick, it was the world. And I believed her. So I let them cut me open. And what they took out wasn't just tissue, it was shame. It was fear. It was every word I believed about myself that wasn't true. He paused. "I'm not here because I was fixed. I'm here because someone stayed. Someone saw me." He looked toward Allison in the crowd. "Now I see you too." Afterward, people clapped not out of pity, but respect. Leo approached him silent as always and slipped something into his pocket. Later, when Frank opened it, he found a drawing. It was of a man standing in the sun, surrounded by a group of children. His scar was still there, but so was his smile. That night, Frank sat by his window with the drawing beside him. The sky was clear, the air still. He lit a candle, opened his journal, and began to write. "I used to think the weight was mine alone, but now I know we all carry something, and maybe if we're brave enough to be seen, someone will help us lift it. The echo of a scar is not in the pain, it is in the memory it leaves behind. Long after the wound is closed, it speaks, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in the silence between breaths." Frank Dawson had learned to live with that silence. But now, for the first time, he listened to what it had to say. The days had become gentle. Each morning he walked the familiar roads of town, no longer a shadow slipping through alleys but a man reclaiming ground. He greeted the grocer, held the door open for strangers, offered directions when asked. People still looked twice, but not with fear, with warmth, with recognition. He had become something of a quiet figure in the community, an emblem not of survival alone, but of return. At the community center, he continued his work with the children. He read stories, taught basic carpentry, and encouraged them to draw things not just as they appeared, but as they felt. Leo Rojas was always there, sketchbook in hand, eyes wide with that rare kind of awareness only certain children possess, half curiosity, half old soul. Frank found himself watching the boy more often, not out of concern, but connection. There was something familiar in the boy's silences, the way he observed rather than filled space, as if he, too, was listening to echoes. One afternoon, the center held a small, open art exhibit. Drawings by the children lined the walls, paper birds, trees, and crayon portraits of pets and superheroes. Leo's drawing was different. It was of Frank, not as he appeared now, but as he once was. The tumor was there, rendered with surprising accuracy and tenderness, but so was the scarf, the cap, the downward glance. Behind him a shadow stood tall, faceless, yet undeniably present. Beneath it, the boy had written one word in block letters, "Seen." Frank stared at the drawing for a long time. It wasn't just art, it was a mirror. Later that day, as he was packing up supplies, a woman approached. She was in her 40s, with lines gently framing her eyes, not from age alone, but from laughter from life. She wore a soft green blouse the color of early spring, and her hair was tied back in a way that suggested both practicality and grace. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm. "Are you Frank?" He turned. Nodded. "I'm Clara," she said, extending a hand. "Leo's mother." They shook hands briefly, warmly. Clara paused as if searching for words that had long waited to be spoken. "I've been meaning to thank you," she said, "for being so kind to my son." Frank smiled. "He's the one doing the teaching." She tilted her head. "You look familiar," she murmured. "Have we met before?" He hesitated. The lake, the edge of the water, the voice that stopped him. His chest tightened. He studied her face, not for features but for presence, for the feeling he remembered like a fading song. "I don't think so," he said. But his voice caught. Clara's eyes searched his, and something flickered there, a whisper of memory. That night Frank returned home with a strange ache in his chest, not pain, not sorrow, just weight, the kind of weight that comes from the past brushing lightly against the present. He pulled out an old journal, the one with water-stained pages and dog-eared corners. He found the entry from years ago, the day at the lake. She didn't say much, just asked if I was okay, but it was the way she said it, like she meant it, like she saw me. He closed the journal, sat in the dark, and listened. The next day, Clara came to the center earlier than usual. She stood at the doorway for a while before stepping inside. "I remembered," she said softly. Frank turned. "I didn't at first. It was so long ago. But I remembered the lake. You were standing there. I was walking my dog. I almost didn't say anything. But something in me just—" She stopped. Tears shimmered in her eyes but did not fall. "I always wondered what happened to you," she whispered. Frank swallowed hard. "I always wondered who you were." They stood in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. The kind that holds truth gently. "Thank you," he said at last. "No," she replied. "Thank you for staying." They sat together that afternoon beneath the same sycamore tree he once watched from behind a curtain. Leo drew nearby, humming softly to himself. Clara told him about her life, how she had moved away for college, married young, lost her husband in a car accident, raised Leo on her own. How she never forgot the man by the lake and always hoped he found peace. Frank told her about the years in hiding, about Allison, about the day he chose to be seen. Neither one tried to make it poetic. It already was. A week later, Leo brought Frank another drawing. This time it was of two people sitting beneath a tree. One had a scar, the other held his hand. Frank framed it and placed it on the wall beside his mother's photo. He looked at it every morning before leaving home. One crisp morning, Allison visited him. She had been traveling, speaking at a conference about dignity-based care. Her voice was now being heard in the places that once dismissed compassion as secondary to treatment. Frank made her tea. They sat in comfortable quiet. "I think I'm going to start a group," he said, "for people like me, people with scars." She smiled. "You already have." Before she left, she handed him a small envelope. He opened it after she was gone. Inside was a photograph him standing in front of the community center, smiling Leo beside him. On the back, she had written, "Some weights become wings." That night, Frank opened his journal one last time. He didn't write much, just one line. "I am no longer invisible, and that changes everything." He folded the page carefully, tucked it into the back cover, and turned off the light.